The roar of a crowd echoes across a sunlit field, a blur of colorful banners and laughing faces. This scene from a modern festival feels like a window to the past. But what are we really seeing? Beneath the pageantry of today's events lies a forgotten world of play, one that was far stranger and more intense than any joust. This journey will give you the true origins of every game you see at a Renaissance fair, revealing the history behind the spectacle. We will uncover why knights risked death for a wooden ring, how a village football game could turn into a riot, and what brutal contest involved a spinning post and a swinging sandbag. When you see people in costume throwing axes or cheering a mounted duel, you will know the centuries-old stories they are reenacting, often without even realizing it. What does our modern desire to play these old games tell us about the people we once were? For the people of the Middle Ages, a festival was not a simple escape from daily life. It was the very pulse of the community, a necessary release valve built into the rhythm of the year. These were not casual diversions, but events woven into the sacred and secular calendar. They marked the end of the harvest, celebrated a saint's day, honored a royal wedding, or provided a sanctioned break during the long, solemn stretch of Lent. The games played were far more than amusement. They were a form of social glue, a display of local pride, and sometimes a subtle negotiation of power. This leads us to a fascinating concept central to understanding these events, the idea of misrule. For a short, glorious period, the normal order of society could be turned upside down. A peasant might be crowned lord of misrule, giving orders to his social betters. Mockery of authority was not just allowed, it was expected. This temporary inversion was a safety mechanism. It allowed tensions to vent in a controlled, ritualized way, so that when the festival ended, everyone returned to their proper stations, the hierarchy reaffirmed rather than broken. Within this charged atmosphere, three distinct types of games emerged, each serving a different purpose. First were the tests of martial skill, the closest thing to military training disguised as sport. Then came the tests of raw strength and agility, where the common folk could prove their worth. And finally, the games of chance and wit, where luck and cunning ruled the day. To understand the spectacle, we must start with the most dangerous and prestigious category, where the line between sport and warfare was perilously thin. At the apex of this martial world stood the joust, the ultimate test of a knight's skill and nerve. Yet its origins were far more chaotic than the one-on-one duels we picture today. It began as the tournament, a massive mock battle called a melee, where teams of armored knights fought across miles of countryside, capturing opponents for ransom. It was brutal, often lethal, and seen by the church as a sinful distraction from holy wars. Over centuries, this chaos was refined and contained. The sprawling melee gave way to the focus joust, a single pass between two riders along a barrier called a tilt. This was not just safer, it transformed the event into a spectacular, measurable sport. The equipment itself tells a story of this evolution. The lance was not a sharp weapon of war, but a blunt, hollow tube designed to shatter on impact, its dramatic splintering a key measure of a powerful strike. The shield was bolted directly to the knight's left shoulder, allowing him to absorb the tremendous collision without losing his grip. And the armor, oh the armor. It was a masterpiece of specialized engineering, with a reinforced left side, a grand helmet bolted to the breastplate, and a lance rest to steady the weapon. This was not battlefield gear. It was sporting equipment for the most dangerous game in town. Victory was judged on a precise system. The highest score came from shattering your lance squarely on your opponent's shield or helmet. Unhorsing them was an instant win, a moment of pure, shocking spectacle. But the rewards went far beyond points. A victorious knight might win a magnificent prize, a purse of gold, or most coveted of all, the favor of a noble lady, often a silk scarf or sleeve tied to his armor. He could also claim his opponent's horse and armor as ransom, a fortune lost or won in seconds. This duality is what made the joust so powerful. It was a genuine, bone-jarring test of martial prowess where men could and did die. Yet it was also a pageant, a theatrical display of chivalric ideals like courage, courtesy, and loyalty. The knight was both athlete and actor, performing a story of honor for an adoring crowd. He fought not just to win, but to build a legend. But the joust was never just a sport. It was a living, breathing political theater staged on an epic scale. Before a single lance was lowered, the spectacle began with a grand parade. Knights, resplendent in polished steel and vibrant silks, would process before the crowd. Each was a walking billboard of identity, his coat of arms emblazoned on his shield, his horse's trappings, and the flowing cloth surcoat over his armor. This visual language was not for show. It was a critical announcement of lineage, allegiance, and status. And the key to reading it all was the herald. Dressed in his own distinctive tabard, this master of ceremony and genealogy was the event's narrator. He announced each knight, proclaimed their family motto, and explained the complex symbolism of their heraldry to the roaring masses. Through him, every participant was framed as a character in a grand chivalric drama. For kings and powerful nobles, hosting a tournament was the ultimate power play. It was a public demonstration of immense wealth, as the cost of prizes, feasts, and temporary arenas could bankrupt a lesser lord. More importantly, it was a tool of statecraft. A monarch could gather his most powerful and potentially rebellious barons to a single event. There, under the guise of sport, they would compete for his favor, reaffirm their loyalty through oaths sworn before the games, and witness the crown's splendor firsthand. These events could also cement crucial alliances. The most famous example is the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520. It was not a war, but a summit disguised as a festival. For over 2 weeks, the kings of England and France tried to outdo each other in a breathtaking display of tents made of cloth of gold, endless feasts, and of course, jousts. Every shattered lance and gracious victory was a carefully choreographed message of power and diplomacy. Yet, for all its pageantry, the danger was always real. The steel was blunt, but the force was immense. In 1559, a splinter from a shattered lance pierced the visor of King Henry II of France during a celebratory joust. He died days later from the wound. This single, tragic accident plunged France into a political crisis, altering the course of European history. It was the starkest reminder that beneath the silk and ceremony, this was a deadly serious game. The joust's legacy, then, is this perfect, precarious balance. It was a genuine martial contest that forged and tested warriors. It was a dazzling piece of political theater that projected power and negotiated peace. And for the common people packing the viewing stands, it was the greatest show on earth, a chance to witness their lords and heroes performing the ideals of an age, all while holding their breath for the next thunderous collision. While the joust was the thunderous spectacle of the elite, another contest hummed with a quieter, deadlier intensity on the festival grounds. This was the world of archery, a skill so vital to national defense that it was enforced by royal decree. In England, a series of laws stretching back to the 1300s mandated that every able-bodied man practice with the longbow each Sunday. This was not a suggestion, it was a civic duty. The reason was written in the blood-soaked mud of battlefields like Agincourt, where a rain of English arrows decimated a much larger French force. The longbow was not just a weapon, it was a great social equalizer. A humble yeoman farmer, with enough strength and years of practice, could launch a yard-long arrow that could pierce plate armor at 200 yards, toppling a mounted knight who had trained from childhood. This immense power came at a physical cost. Examinations of archers' skeletons show enlarged left arms and stress deformations in their shoulders and spines, permanent marks of a life spent drawing a bow with a pull weight equal to lifting a full-grown man. So how did a society ensure its men maintained this brutal, essential skill outside of wartime? The answer was the festival contest, which transformed grueling practice into communal sport. The most common form was shooting at the butts. These were not the round targets we imagine today, but large earthen mounds, often covered with turf, set at measured distances along a field. Men would shoot in pairs or groups, their arrows thudding into the soft earth or, for the skilled, striking a painted mark on a canvas face. This built the muscle memory for accuracy. But festivals also hosted more specialized and spectacular challenges. Clout shooting was a test of raw power and trajectory. Archers would aim not at a vertical target, but at a flag or clout laid flat on the ground a staggering 240 yards away. They had to arc their shots high into the air, calculating the wind and drop, to land their arrow as close to the mark as possible. It was less about precision and more about controlled, repeatable force, the very skill needed to send a volley over the front lines of an enemy army. Then there was the popinjay shoot, a test of a completely different kind of accuracy. Instead of a distant target, archers aimed vertically. A wooden bird, often a parrot or popinjay, was mounted on a high pole or the mast of a ship. Using specially made, blunted arrows that would not stick in the wood, competitors took turns trying to knock the bird from its perch. This required a steady hand and a fine touch, as the target was small and the angle was awkward. The winner, who finally dislodged the bird, was crowned the festival's captain of the popinjay, a title of great local honor. But the social function of these contests went far beyond crowning a champion. They were fundamentally communal events. After the shooting, the real festival often began. The men would gather, bows put aside, for a wassail. This was a boisterous ceremony of shared drink, usually from a large wooden bowl of spiced ale or cider passed from person to person. Songs were sung, toasts were made to the king's health and the next year's harvest, and the community bonded. The archery contest, therefore, served a dual purpose. It honed a critical wartime skill under the guise of peaceful competition, and it strengthened the very social fabric that would be called upon in times of war. The festival field was, in essence, a peacetime training ground where the strength of the nation was quietly, consistently reinforced, one carefully aimed shot and one shared cup at a time. Yet for every knight who thundered down the tilt yard, there were 100 young squires dreaming of that moment, and their training ground was far less glamorous. It featured a device that was simple, brutal, and unforgiving, a spinning teacher of hard knocks known as the Quintain. Picture a stout wooden post set firmly in the ground, with a crossbar mounted on top like a windmill. On one end of this crossbar hung a heavy shield or a wooden target. On the other end swung a weight, often a sandbag or a stout club, This was the knight's training wheel, and it demanded perfection. A young rider, lance couched, would charge the Quintain at full gallop. His goal was to strike the shield squarely in its center with the point of his lance. A clean, centered hit would push the crossbar smoothly around, allowing him to pass without consequence. But a strike that was even slightly off-center, or too high or too low, would transfer uneven force. The crossbar would spin violently, and that weighted arm on the opposite end would come whipping around in a punishing arc. The sandbag or club would smash into the rider's back as he passed, a humiliating and painful reminder of his error. It was a lesson delivered by physics, not a tutor, and it was unforgettable. At festivals, the Quintain was not just a training tool, but a public spectacle and a rite of passage. Young aspirants and even seasoned knights looking to hone their accuracy would take turns charging the device before a cheering, and sometimes laughing, crowd. It was a game of high-stakes precision where failure was met with immediate physical comedy. A perfect strike brought cheers and respect, a mark of a steady hand and a true seat. A poor strike that sent the rider tumbling from his saddle or lurching forward from a blow to the shoulders brought roars of laughter. A dose of humility served with the festival ale. This simple spinning post taught the most critical lesson of the joust, control. It was not about brute strength, but about the marriage of speed, aim, and balance. The Quintain demanded that her rider become one with his horse, that he judge distance and timing perfectly, and that he commit fully to the strike. To master it was to prove you had the fundamental skills to graduate from the training field to the glittering, dangerous world of the real lists. It was the grueling, repetitive work behind the glorious pageantry, and its presence at a festival was a promise, a glimpse of the next generation of champions in the making. But the festival grounds were not reserved for knights and archers alone. For the vast majority of people, the most thrilling contests were those of raw, unadorned strength, where the only armor was a thick hide and a stubborn will. This was the world of wrestling, the true people's sport, known across Europe by names like folkstyle or collar and elbow. Forget the choreographed spectacle of modern entertainment. This was a brutal, foundational contest with almost no rules, a direct test of manhood that drew roaring crowds and settled long-standing scores. In England, the collar and elbow style was particularly iconic. Competitors began each bout gripping each other's loose linen shirts at the collar with one hand and at the elbow with the other. From this locked position, it was a battle of balance, leverage, and sheer grit, where trips, throws, and holds were all fair game until one man's back touched the ground. There were no weight classes, no time limits. A brawny blacksmith could find himself matched against a lanky farmer, and victory often went not to the largest, but to the cleverest and most tenacious. The chaos did not stop there. In some regions, the line between sport and pure masochistic challenge blurred entirely. Consider the practice known as purring, or more plainly, shin kicking. In contests held at fairs and festivals, two men would lock arms at the shoulders and then proceed to kick each other's shins with their hardened leather boots until one surrendered from the pain. To add a bizarre layer of ritual, they would sometimes stuff their trouser legs with straw for minimal padding, but the goal was still to inflict enough agony to force a submission. It was less a display of skill and more a public trial of pain tolerance, a bizarre spectacle of endurance that seems almost incomprehensible today. Why would communities embrace such raw and violent pastimes? The reasons were woven deeply into the social fabric. First, these bouts were a powerful outlet for local pride. Villages and towns would put forward their champions, and a victory was a collective boast, proof that their men were the strongest, the toughest, the most enduring. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the wrestling ring or the kicking ground often served as a sanctioned arena for settling disputes. Two men with a grudge over land, a debt, or an insult could agree to wrestle it out before the whole community. The public nature of the contest meant the outcome was witnessed by all, providing a clear, decisive, and socially accepted resolution. The loser, having been physically bested in front of his peers, was expected to let the matter drop. In this way, a potentially destabilizing feud could be channeled into a single, brutal, but contained explosion of energy. The outcomes were often as raw as the contests themselves. Broken bones, dislocated joints, and severe bruising were commonplace. Yet, these injuries were worn as badges of honor, proof of participation in a rite that reinforced the social order. While the knights jousted for glory and ransom, the common man wrestled for respect and resolution. His arena had no banners or heraldry, just a circle of stomping, shouting neighbors, and his victory was not measured in gold or favor, but in the enduring silence of a settled argument and the bolstered pride of his home turf. This visceral world of folk combat reveals a fundamental truth about medieval festivals. For all their pageantry, they were also pressure valves, where the tensions of daily life could be released in a roar of pain, effort, and communal catharsis. The raw power of the wrestling ring found its echo in another, more explosive festival contest. While wrestling tested leveraged strength and endurance, the games of stone putting and weight throwing were pure demonstrations of brute force, a single mighty effort that could silence a crowd. These were the classic heavy events, where a man's worth could be measured in the distance a rock flew. The most common was putting the stone, the direct ancestor of the modern Olympic shot put. But the medieval version was far less standardized. The stone could be any heavy, smooth rock from a nearby riverbed or field, often weighing between 15 and 30 pounds. There were no shot-put circles or strict techniques. A competitor would simply take his stance, often with a short run-up, and heave the stone from his shoulder or chest, using his entire body as a lever. The goal was singular, to send it farther than any other man could. Alongside the stone, men would throw heavy metal weights or hammer-like objects. These were not the sleek, wire-handled hammers of today's athletics, but often actual blacksmith's hammers or crude iron blocks attached to a wooden handle. The throwing motion was a wild, spinning heave, a full-body whirl that sent the weight sailing in a low, dangerous arc. The origins of these games were not born in sport, but in the daily grind of peasant life. The motion of putting a heavy stone was the same used to load hay bales onto a cart or heave a sack of grain. The hammer throw mirrored the action of swinging a sledgehammer to drive fence posts or break rock. These contests, then, were a natural extension of the farmyard, a chance to turn essential labor into spectacular competition. For the military-minded lord, they also served a practical purpose. The strength needed to launch a heavy stone was the same strength required to wield a heavy poleaxe or to scale a siege ladder under the weight of armor. A village champion in the stone put was a man you wanted on your side when the castle walls needed breaching. The atmosphere during these events was electric. Unlike the silent tension of archery or the structured rounds of the joust, the heavy events were bursts of raw, immediate drama. The crowd would gather in a loose semicircle behind the throwing line, their eyes fixed on the lone figure preparing his effort. There was a collective intake of breath as he wound his body like a spring, followed by a grunt of effort and the thud of his planting foot. Then the stone or weight would fly, a dark shape against the sky, and every head would turn to track its flight. A mighty throw would be met with a roaring wave of approval, shouts of local pride if the champion was from their village, or groans of dismay if he was from a rival parish. For a peasant laborer, this was one of the few paths to genuine, lasting renown. His name would not be recorded in heraldic rolls or sung by minstrels, but it would be remembered in the taverns and fields for years. He became the strongman of his village, the man who threw the stone past the old oak tree, a local legend built on a single Herculean effort. His victory brought no ransom or noble favor, but something perhaps more valuable, the deep, earned respect of his community and the knowledge that his strength had literally moved the marker of what was possible. In a world defined by rigid social hierarchy, the flying stone was a rare and powerful argument, one that spoke a universal language everyone could understand. That raw individual strength found its ultimate expression in a contest where a single man was no longer enough. If the stone put celebrated the power of one, the tug of war was a roaring testament to the power of many. This was the game that turned a village into a single, living organism. A battle of collective will fought over a simple, muddy rope. The setup was deceptively basic. A thick, tarred hemp rope, often as long as a city street, was laid across a boundary line, usually a stream or a ditch filled with water and mud. Teams, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, would line up along each end. But these were not random groups of friends. The teams were meticulously organized along the deepest fault lines of medieval society. It was one parish against a neighboring parish, the men of the North Field against the men of the South Field, or the powerful Weavers' Guild challenging the Butchers' Guild. This transformed the game from a simple test of strength into a proxy war, a chance to settle old scores about grazing rights, market privileges, or simple, simmering pride without drawing a single blade. The signal to start might be a flag drop or a blast from a horn, and then the world would dissolve into a unified, agonizing strain. Hundreds of men would dig their heels into the earth, their backs bending almost parallel to the ground, their hands burning as they hauled on the coarse rope. The air would fill with a collective grunt of effort, shouted commands from team captains, and the deafening roar of two entire communities screaming for their side. For minutes that felt like hours, the rope would sway with a terrible, tense equilibrium, the central marker trembling over the muddy ditch. Victory was never a slow, steady gain. It was a sudden, catastrophic collapse. One team would find a final surge of coordinated energy, a unified heave that broke the spirit and the grip of their opponents. The losing side would tumble backward in a chaotic, sprawling heap, often directly into the waiting water and mire, to the triumphant jeers and celebrations of the victors. The origins of this ritual may stretch back to a time before Christianity, to pagan ceremonies meant to ensure a good harvest. Some folklorists suggest the two teams once symbolized the forces of light and darkness, or summer and winter, with the tug acting out the struggle for seasonal dominance. Pulling the rope was, in a sense, pulling the sun back into the sky, or dragging the fertility into the fields. By the medieval period, that ancient magical thinking had faded, but the deep, symbolic power remained. The game still embodied a fundamental truth about survival. In a world of shared plows, communal harvests, and village defense, your strength was only as good as your neighbor's. The tug of war was a physical rehearsal of that unity, a visceral reminder that when you all pulled together, you could move the world, or at least drag your rivals in the creek. It was the festival's loudest, messiest, and most democratic lesson. Every man, from the wealthiest yeoman to the poorest laborer, had an equal place on the rope. His individual might vanished into the collective strain, and in that shared effort, the very identity of the community was forged, tested, and triumphantly confirmed. The roaring unity of the tug-of-war could, with the introduction of a single object, explode into glorious, unchecked anarchy. That object was an inflated animal bladder, and the game was mob football, the chaotic, violent ancestor of the world's most popular sport. Forget everything you know about modern soccer. This was a festival of controlled riot, played with almost no rules on a field that could be the entire town. There were no teams in the modern sense, just two amorphous masses of humanity, often representing rival parishes or the married men against the bachelors. The goals were not nets, but landmarks miles apart, like the door of one village church versus the millpond of the next. The objective was simple: carry, kick, or throw the ball to your goal by any means necessary. The path was whatever lay between, leading hundreds of players charging through streets, across plowed fields, over streams, and through private gardens. It was less a sport and more a territorial migration fueled by collective frenzy. The ball itself was a crude, lumpy thing, a pig's bladder inflated by mouth, and sometimes encased in leather for durability. It did not bounce or fly with precision. It skittered and rolled, leading the swarming mob on a mad, unpredictable chase. Players would trip over it, fight in heaving scrums to dig it free from the mud, and boot it wildly forward only to see it bounce off a stone wall and into the hands of an opponent. The violence was not a side effect. It was part of the game. Tackling was universal and brutal, with players often being stripped of their clothing in the melee. Broken bones, gashes, and trampling were common hazards, accepted as the price of participation. Unsurprisingly, the authorities loathed it. For centuries, kings and town councils issued bans, citing the public disorder, the broken shop windows, the trampled crops, and the injuries that left men unable to work. One royal proclamation from the 1300s complained the game caused a great uproar in the city, to the annoyance of the king's majesty. Yet, like water finding a crack, the game persisted. It became inextricably linked to Shrove Tuesday, the final day of feasting before the summer fast of Lent. On that one day, the normal rules of society were suspended. The chaotic, bodily release of the football match was a perfect ritual of misrule, a final explosion of energy before weeks of piety and restraint. A town might officially forbid the game, but its citizens would simply take it outside the town walls, into the open fields, where the ancient tradition could run its course. In this way, mob football was the ultimate folk game. It required no special equipment, no noble sanction, and no herald to explain it. It was pure democratic chaos, a testament to a community's need for a shared, physical catharsis that no law could fully extinguish. The modern global sport of soccer, with its precise rules and manicured pitches, grew from this muddy, roaring, and wonderfully lawless root. Yet the thunder of hooves at a festival was not always the sound of armored knights colliding. A different kind of equestrian energy pulsed through the fairgrounds, one far more accessible and just as fiercely competitive. This was the world of informal horse racing, a sport that blurred the rigid lines of medieval society. For one exhilarating moment, the field was open to anyone with a horse and the courage to ride it fast. Knights would certainly enter, but so would wealthy merchants, yeomen farmers, and even daring peasants, each mounted on whatever steed they possessed. You might see a knight's powerful, lumbering destrier, bred for carrying immense weight in battle, lined up beside a merchant's sleek palfrey, bred for comfortable travel, and a farmer's sturdy cob, more used to pulling a plow than sprinting. This created a wonderfully unpredictable spectacle, where breeding and expense did not always guarantee victory. The races themselves took many forms, each testing a different aspect of horsemanship. The simplest was the flat race, a straight, furious dash down a measured stretch of meadow, a pure test of a horse's raw speed and a rider's ability to hold on. More complex and thrilling was the point-to-point race. In this version, riders were not confined to a track. They were given two distant landmarks, perhaps a church spire and a windmill, and told to race from one to the other by any route they chose. This turned the entire countryside into the arena. Riders would gallop across fields, leap hedges and ditches, ford streams, and navigate around woodlands, each trying to find the fastest path. This chaotic cross-country charge is the direct ancestor of the modern sport of steeplechase, named for the practice of using a distant church steeple as a visible marker to race toward. The atmosphere surrounding these races was electric with more than just excitement. It was charged with the palpable tension of gambling. Betting was rampant and informal. Spectators would wager everything from a few pennies to a fattened pig on their favorite horse or rider. You would see intense huddles of men arguing odds, nobles placing large bets with gold coins, and farmers staking a day's wages on a hunch. This gambling frenzy was a core part of the festive experience, a shared risk that made every spectator feel personally invested in the outcome of the race. For the common people, these races offered a rare form of social leveling. A peasant with a naturally swift horse could, through sheer luck and daring, outrun his social betters and claim the prize, which might be a purse of silver, a bolt of fine cloth, or simply a barrel of ale. His victory would be celebrated by his peers as a triumph of the underdog, a temporary inversion of the natural order that was perfectly acceptable within the festival's spirit of misrule. The informal horse race, therefore, was more than just a game. It was a vibrant social mixer where different classes met on the neutral, muddy ground of competition. It was a celebration of the horse not just as a weapon of war or a symbol of status, but as a partner in speed and a source of communal joy. In the roaring crowd and the pounding hooves, you could hear the democratic heartbeat of the festival, a rhythm far removed from the solemn, ceremonial clash of the joust. The pounding chaos of the horse race gave way to a different kind of theater, one of hushed anticipation and breathtaking grace. While the crowd roared for the wrestlers and the racers, the highest nobility often engaged in a contest of profound silence, the art of falconry. This was not a game of strength or speed, but of exquisite control, a partnership between man and bird that served as the ultimate symbol of aristocratic refinement. To own and fly a bird of prey was a privilege enshrined in law, with strict rules across Europe reserving specific species for specific ranks. Only an emperor could fly an eagle, a king might fly a gerfalcon, and a knight would fly a peregrine. The bird on your gloved fist was a living, breathing declaration of your social standing. At a festival, these demonstrations were a quiet but fierce competition. Lords and ladies would gather in open fields, their prized falcons and hawks hooded and restless on their wrists. The contests were subtle but intense. One competition judged which bird could achieve the highest pitch, climbing in majestic spirals until it was a mere speck against the sun before stooping, or diving upon a lure. Another tested the bird's training and obedience, with handlers calling their falcons back from great distances, rewarding a swift, direct return with a choice piece of meat. The most dramatic displays were the live hunts, where birds were flown at game like herons, ducks, or hares. Here, the measure was the clean, decisive strike, a testament to years of meticulous training. The bond required was immense. A falconer might spend months, even years, patiently manning a bird, acclimating it to human presence, teaching it to associate the glove with food and safety. The equipment itself spoke of wealth and care, from the intricately tooled leather hoods and jesses to the tiny silver bells attached to the bird's legs, whose gentle ringing allowed the falconer to locate his charge in dense brush. In a world of loud, communal games, falconry stood apart. It was a silent ballet of instinct and discipline, a demonstration that true power lay not in noise, but in the patient cultivation of a wild thing's loyalty. The soaring falcon was a lord's soul made visible, a creature of the air bound to earth only by the thinnest thread of trust and training. While the falcon soared in silent aristocracy, the common folk sought their fortune in the smoky, raucous world of the tavern. Here, beneath the low timber beams, games of pure chance and cunning strategy ruled the night, a world away from the muddy fields and thundering hooves. This was the realm of board and dice, where a lucky roll could mean a free drink, and a clever move could settle a score. The most popular board game was tables, the direct ancestor of backgammon. Played on a board with 24 points, players raced their pieces around based on the roll of 2 dice, trying to bear them all off before their opponent. It was a perfect blend of luck and tactical skill, fast-paced and deeply addictive. For those who preferred pure strategy, there was chess, a game of war imported from the Islamic world and adored by the nobility, and the simpler but devilishly clever nine men's Morris. This game, played on a board carved into a tavern table or scratched into the dirt, involved placing and then moving 3 pieces each, trying to form lines of 3 to capture your opponent's men. It was a game of traps and foresight, often played for small stakes with intense concentration. But the true heartbeat of tavern gambling was the dice. Small bone cubes were ubiquitous, carried in pouches, and produced at a moment's notice for a quick game of hazard, the complicated forerunner of modern craps. The rattle of dice in a leather cup was the soundtrack of the medieval night, a promise of instant fortune or loss, and where there is fortune, trickery is never far behind. Cheating was rampant, and the tools of the trade had their own slang. Loaded dice were called fulhams, after a London suburb notorious for their production. These dice were weighted with drops of mercury or lead, or had faces subtly shaved to make certain numbers more likely to appear. A skilled cheat or a dice cogger could palm a die, switch in a fulham for a fair one, or use a magnetic table and a die with an iron load. The atmosphere around these games was a volatile mix of hope, ale, and sharp eyes. A player suspected of using fulhams might find himself accused in a roar of anger, the game money snatched back, and a brawl erupting over the trestle tables. These fights were so common they became a standard part of festival lore, a predictable risk in the pursuit of a lucky break. So while the knight demonstrated control over a bird of prey, the peasant in the tavern gambled on controlling the chaotic tumble of bone cubes, a much wilder and more treacherous creature to master. The rattle of dice gave way to the satisfying crack of wood on wood in another corner of the festival grounds. Here, on a long, smooth patch of earth, you would find the medieval bowling alley, a game of precision known as skittles or kales. This was the direct ancestor of modern 10-pin bowling, but with a rustic, improvisational charm. The setup was simple. 9 wooden pins, often called skittles, were set up in a square formation at the end of a narrow lane. The player's weapon was not a standard ball, but often a heavy, rounded object called a cheese, which resembled a thick wooden discus or a flattened sphere. The player would take a few steps and hurl this cheese down the lane, aiming to scatter as many of the 9 pins as possible in a single throw. The goal was to knock them all down, a feat known as a floor, which would win the round and likely a round of drinks. A variation called Kales added a different layer of challenge. In this version, the pins were sometimes set in a single long row. The player would throw a ball, not roll it, often using a curved club to give the ball a guiding whack on its way, trying to take out the entire line with one shot. The skill lay in the angle and the spin, making it a game of physics as much as force. These games were the heartbeat of the tavern yard and the festival green. Almost every village inn had a skittles alley out back, a place for regulars to settle friendly wagers after a day's work. At festivals, temporary alleys would be set up, drawing crowds who cheered for a clean sweep and groaned at a stubborn pin left wobbling. The prizes were simple and social: a side of bacon, a jug of ale, or the glory of having your name announced as the day's champion kegler, an old term for a skittles player. In a world of brutal strength contests, skittles offered a different satisfaction: the clean, geometric pleasure of a perfect strike, a momentary order imposed on chaos with a well-aimed piece of wood. The satisfying crack of skittles gave way to a far more dangerous rhythm on another part of the field: the sharp, percussive thwack of seasoned wood meeting wood. This was the quarterstaff contest, a brutal and beautiful display of the common man's martial art. In an age where a proper sword was a luxury item, often forbidden by law to peasants, the humble quarterstaff was the great equalizer. It was nothing more than a stout pole of hardwood, usually oak or ash, standing 6 to 9 feet tall. A traveler could cut one from a hedgerow for protection on the road. A farmer could use it to vault ditches or herd sheep, and in the hands of a skilled user, it became a devastatingly versatile weapon. Its name came from the way it was gripped, the hands dividing the staff into 4 quarters, allowing for a fluid combination of blocks, strikes, and thrusts. At a festival, this everyday tool was transformed into the centerpiece of a grueling public duel. The rules were simple in description, but demanding in execution. 2 combatants, often wearing little more than padded jackets, would face off within a marked circle. The goal was to strike your opponent on the head or torso, above the waist, while using the staff's length to keep their own attacks at bay. Every blow was meant to be controlled but substantial, a solid impact meant to sting through padding and rattle bones. The contest was a pure test of agility, timing, and sheer toughness. Fighters would advance and retreat in a rhythmic dance, their staffs clacking together in a rapid series of parries as each searched for an opening. A successful strike to the shoulder or ribs would draw a collective wince from the crowd, while a clean, ringing hit to the helmet or skull could stagger a man, seeing stars in the daylight. There were no points for style, only for effect. Fights often continued until one man, bruised, breathless, and battered, verbally yielded or was knocked senseless to the ground. This was not the chivalric theater of the joust, with its codes of honor and noble ladies. This was raw, practical combat skill, born from the necessity of self-preservation on dangerous roads. The crowd adored it precisely because it was relatable. They could understand the weapon, the movements, and the very real pain involved. A local champion known for his skill with the staff was more than just an entertainer. He was a respected figure, a man whose expertise offered a sense of security to his community. His victory at the festival proved that strength and skill were not the sole property of the armored elite, but could be grown from the common soil, honed on a simple piece of wood, and demonstrated for all to see in a storm of controlled, percussive violence. The percussive violence of the quarterstaff duel reveals a harder truth about the medieval world, a line where sport bled into something far darker. Beyond the tests of skill and strength lay a category of entertainment founded not on human competition, but on animal suffering. This was the brutal spectacle of baiting, a practice as common as it was cruel, rooted in a chillingly practical belief. In towns and villages, a bear or a bull would be tethered to a central post in a pit or a courtyard. Specially bred, powerful dogs, often mastiffs, were then set upon it. The crowd would roar as the chained animal, lashing out in terror and pain, fought off its attackers. Dogs would be tossed through the air, gored, or killed, only to be replaced by fresh ones from their handlers. The event continued until the baiting animal was exhausted or dead. The stated justification was not mere amusement. There was a widespread belief that the adrenaline and struggle of the fight tenderized the meat, making it more flavorful and less tough. A baited bull's beef was considered a superior product. This grisly logic wrapped cruelty in practicality, allowing people to frame a vicious spectacle as a necessary prelude to the butcher's block. Alongside this was cockfighting, a sport of pure, distilled violence that cut across all social classes. In tavern yards and specially built circular pits, two roosters, bred for aggression and armed with sharp metal spurs tied to their legs, were placed beak to beak. The fight was a swift flurry of feathers and blood, often over in minutes, with one bird dead or two injured to continue. The ringside was a frenzy of gambling, with nobles, merchants, and laborers alike shouting bets over the chaos, their fortunes rising and falling with the fate of a bird. To understand this, we must step outside modern sensibilities. The medieval view of animals was largely instrumental. They were resources, tools, or threats. Their capacity for suffering was acknowledged, but it rarely outweighed their utility or the human desire for spectacle. In a life already harsh and short, the line between the thrilling and the horrific was drawn in a different place. These brutal games served a dual purpose. They were certainly entertainment, offering a raw, visceral drama of life and death struggle, but they also reinforced a perceived natural order, a hierarchy with humans firmly at the top, demonstrating dominion over even the most powerful beasts. The roar that greeted a mastiff's brave lunge or a gamecock's final strike was a complex sound, one that mixed awe, cruelty, and a stark affirmation of humanity's place in a brutal chain of being. But even amidst the roar of the bear pit and the clatter of the quarterstaff, a different, lighter sound could be heard at the festival's edges, the clear, bright laughter of children. For them, the great games of strength and skill were a distant spectacle. Their world was one of simple, timeless play, games passed down not through royal decree, but from one generation of children to the next. These were the true folk games, crafted from whatever was at hand, and their legacy stretches unbroken into our own backyards. Take the simple hoop and stick. A child would take a wooden circle, perhaps a discarded barrel band, and propel it along by tapping it with a stick, running to keep it upright and rolling. This was not just a chase. It was a lesson in physics and fine motor control, a test of rhythm and balance that could occupy a child for hours across a dusty lane. Then there were marbles, but these were not the glass orbs we know. A medieval child's marbles were often baked balls of clay or carefully rounded stones from a riverbed. The game, however, was instantly familiar. Players would take turns flicking their shooter marble, trying to knock their opponent's marbles out of a chalked circle, the winner claiming all the marbles inside. It was a game of geometry, touch, and gentle competition, teaching hand-eye coordination and the basics of friendly wagering. A game with even more ancient roots was knucklebones, the direct ancestor of jacks. Instead of metal stars and a rubber ball, children used the actual ankle bones of sheep or goats. The goal was the same: to toss the bones into the air and catch them on the back of your hand, or to scoop them up while a small ball was in motion. The clatter of those bones on a stone step was a sound that would have been familiar to children in ancient Rome, a direct thread of play across 1,000 years. And everywhere you would find the simplest game of all, a precursor to cricket or baseball. A child with a stick and a roughly rounded piece of wood would toss the ball into the air and swat it as far as they could, while a friend tried to catch it or retrieve it. This was pure improvised sport, teaching timing, coordination, and the joy of a solid hit. These games were never just idle fun. In a world where children were expected to contribute to the household from a young age, play was a covert training ground. The hoop and stick honed the coordination needed for later guiding a plow or handling tools. Marbles and knucklebones developed the dexterity crucial for tasks like weaving, sewing, or sorting grain. The stick and ball game built the reflexes and strength that would one day be used in scything hay or wielding a quarterstaff for defense. In this way, the festival was a mirror of the entire life cycle. The children played at the skills they saw their elders demonstrating in earnest, their laughter weaving the future workforce and warriors into the social fabric, one flick of a marble, one rolling hoop at a time. The laughter of children at play was just one layer in the festival's rich soundtrack. Another, more deliberate sound competed for attention: the jingle of bells and the sudden burst of a crowd's collective guffaw. This was the domain of the fool, the professional agent of chaos whose job was to dismantle dignity with a well-timed pratfall. Dressed in his distinctive motley coat, his head often shaved except for a single, ridiculous tuft of hair, the fool was a living embodiment of misrule. His comedy was not from a script, but from the moment. He would tumble and juggle, perform impossible backflips, and walk on his hands through the mud, turning the world literally upside down. But his most potent weapon was interaction. He might stage a mock tournament, using a bladder on a stick as a lance to joust with a terrified spectator pulled from the crowd. He would challenge burly wrestlers to contests of balance, only to send them sprawling with a clever trip. His games were absurd and humiliating, a public invitation to laugh at the very idea of taking anything, especially oneself, too seriously. Alongside the fool's physical comedy worked the minstrel, a master of word and song. With a lute or a simple pipe, he did more than just provide background music. He orchestrated participatory games. He led call and response singing contests between halves of the crowd, their voices rising in friendly rivalry. He posed intricate riddles that tested wit, not strength, with the prize often being another round of ale. And he was the perfect master of ceremonies for the game of forfeits. In this popular pastime, participants, often young men and women, would play a simple game of chance or skill. The loser, however, did not pay a coin. They paid with their dignity, performing a silly task dictated by the winner and enforced by the laughing minstrel. A proud knight might be forced to bray like a donkey. A dignified merchant's wife might have to sing a love song to the village swineherd. These forfeits were a delicious inversion, a safe space where social roles could be mocked, and the high brought temporarily low, all under the approving eye of the musician who set the tune. Together, the fool and the minstrel created the festival's interactive heart. They transformed passive spectators into unwilling accomplices and joyful participants. Their stage was the entire fairground, and their script was written in the moment, using the raw material of human pride and pretense. In a world of rigid hierarchy, their games provided a crucial, laughter-filled pressure valve, reminding everyone that beneath the silks and the armor, they were all just people, capable of looking foolish and, for a few blessed hours, finding profound joy in that very fact. Beyond the fools, antics lay a different kind of performance, one where the only audience was a hopeful customer and the only stage was a rickety wooden stall. This was the festival marketplace, a carnival of chance where a commoner's few pennies could buy a moment of thrilling possibility. Here, the grand contests of strength gave way to intimate games of skill and pure luck, each booth promising a tangible prize for a perfect throw or a lucky guess. You could test your aim by hurling stones at a line of wooden bottles, trying to topple them all for a garish ribbon or a simple clay whistle. Another popular challenge was an early form of ring toss, where players would buy 3 wooden hoops and attempt to lob them over the neck of a prized bottle or a peg carved in the shape of a swan. But the king of these stalls was the shy, a term derived from the French word for a target. In this game, players would throw wooden balls or rough-hewn sticks to knock down a collection of objects arranged on a shelf. The prizes were often displayed temptingly behind the counter, a colorful array of gingerbread cakes, small pottery jugs, or ribbons that fluttered in the breeze. The atmosphere was a potent mix of concentration and laughter. The thud of a successful hit met with cheers from onlookers and the proud grin of the stallholder as he handed over the spoils. Yet this cheerful scene had a dark, cunning undercurrent. For every honest game, there were 2 operated by canaille catchers, the smooth-talking con artists of the Elizabethan underworld. Their stalls were masterpieces of deception. The wooden bottles for the throwing game might be weighted at the bottom, making them almost impossible to knock over. The rings for the toss might be deliberately sized, just a fraction too small to fit cleanly over the prize bottle's neck, and the objects on the shy shelf. They could be subtly glued in place or balanced in such a way that they required an impossible amount of force to dislodge. The canaille catcher was a performer in his own right, often working with a shill in the crowd who would win a few easy rounds to build false confidence. He would banter with customers, downplay the difficulty, and express genuine seeming surprise when a strong throw failed to topple a target. He exploited hope itself, turning the simple desire to win a trinket into a lesson in street-smart skepticism. For the medieval festival goer, then, the marketplace game was a microcosm of life itself. It offered a glittering reward for a display of skill, but it also demanded a sharp eye to see past the illusion, to recognize the rigged game before your hard-earned coin was gone. The canaille catcher's rigged game was a risk you accepted for a ribbon or a whistle, but the true, guaranteed reward of the festival was far more substantial. It was a feast. After the dust settled from the races and the cheers faded from the wrestling ring, the community gathered to share in the ultimate celebration of plenty, a direct and delicious payoff for enduring a year of grueling labor and meager winter rations. The food served was not everyday fare. This was seasonal, celebratory excess, a tangible manifestation of the harvest success. On long trestle tables set up in the open air, you would find whole oxen or pigs turning on spits over roaring fires, their skins crisping to a deep, glistening brown. Enormous pies, their crusts sturdy enough to serve as containers, were filled with mixtures of game birds, dried fruits, and rich spices. The air hung heavy with the smells of wood smoke, roasting meat, and sweet, yeasty bread. To wash it down, there were rivers of ale, brewed stronger and darker for the occasion, and for those who could afford it, hypocris. This was the drink of nobility, a sweet, spiced wine made by infusing red wine with expensive imports like cinnamon, ginger, and grains of paradise, then straining it through a cloth bag called a hypocris bag. It was served warm, a fragrant, potent symbol of luxury. For the common folk, food was not just sustenance, it was often the prize itself. Winning a wrestling match or a skittles tournament might earn you a side of bacon or a fat goose, a direct transfer of wealth that would feed your family for weeks. The champion archer might be awarded a whole sheep, a prize that was both an honor and a vital economic boost. This practice turned victory into something immediately practical and deeply satisfying, a hero's welcome you could literally bring home to your hearth. And of course, with the food came the drink, and with the drink came contests of a different, more reckless kind. Drinking games were a staple of the tavern side of the festival, where men would compete to drain enormous tankards of ale the fastest, or to hold their liquor while performing silly tasks. These contests were less about skill and more about endurance and bravado, a public surrender to the festival's spirit of abandon. This atmosphere of calculated excess was the entire point. For a few short days, the relentless scarcity and discipline of medieval life were not just forgotten. They were actively defied. You ate meat when you normally had none. You drank ale not as a weak daily beverage, but as a strong celebratory flood. You indulged in flavors and quantities that were otherwise unthinkable. This was not mere gluttony, it was a ritual of renewal. By consuming the bounty of the land together, the community reaffirmed its survival and its strength. The festival feast was the roaring, flavorful heart of the entire event, the shared reward that made the risks of the games and the toil of the year feel worthwhile, a collective memory of fullness to carry back into the long, lean months ahead. The roaring feast and its reckless drinking games painted a picture of a festival dominated by men, but that view is a historical illusion. Women were not passive shadows at the edges of these events. They were central to its very heart, weaving a complex thread of influence, participation, and sometimes troubling objectification through the fabric of the games. As spectators, they formed a vital part of the audience, their presence and approval the invisible fuel for much of the masculine display. The joust was not just a test of strength, it was a performance for their eyes. A knight did not simply win points, he competed for the ultimate non-material prize, the favor of a noble lady. This favor was a deeply symbolic act. She might tie a silk sleeve or a scarf to his lance or armor, publicly marking him as her champion. In that moment, she was not a prize to be won, but a sponsor and an arbiter of worth. Her gesture transformed the martial contest into a story of courtly love, where his courage was performed in her name. This power to confer honor made women essential critics and patrons of the chivalric theater, their cheers and silences shaping a knight's reputation as powerfully as his skill with a lance. Beyond the viewing stands, women found their own arenas for physical expression. While barred from the brutal wrestling rings and the joust, they were active participants in dances, foot races, and even archery in some regions. The festival dance was far more than mere entertainment. It was a structured social game with high stakes. One popular form was the love dance or kiss in the ring. In this lively circle game, a young man would dance into the center and choose a partner, stealing a quick, sanctioned kiss before the dance continued and another took his turn. This was a ritual of flirtation and courtship conducted in full view of the community, a safe and playful space for romantic connection that operated under the festival's temporary suspension of everyday formality. For women, these dances and informal foot races were rare opportunities for bodily freedom and public visibility, a chance to be seen not as a daughter or a wife, but as a participant in the collective joy. Yet this same festive atmosphere contained a darker mirror. In the chivalric fantasy woven around the joust, the lady's favor was a symbol of inspired devotion. But in some cruder, more popular contests, this symbolism could curdle into outright objectification. There are accounts, particularly from later rustic fairs, where the prize for a winning competitor in a race or a brawl was not a purse or a side of bacon, but a kiss from the festival's chosen queen, or worse, the right to escort her home. Here, the woman was transformed from a sponsor into a commodity, her consent assumed by the rules of the game. This practice exposes the uncomfortable duality of her role. She could be the honored inspiration, the active dancer, and yet also become the trophy, her personhood reduced to a reward for male victory. This tension reminds us that the festival was a microcosm of medieval society itself, a place where existing social structures were both challenged and reinforced. For a woman, the day could offer a taste of agency and celebration, even as it reflected back the limits of her world, a world where she could judge the game, dance within its circle, but all too easily be seen as just another part of the prize. That complex tapestry of celebration and cruelty could not last forever. The roar of the bear pit and the chaotic fury of mob football eventually met a powerful, silencing force, the rise of puritanical thought in the 16th and 17th centuries. To the Puritans, these festivals were not harmless fun. They were sinful indulgences, a dangerous cocktail of idleness, drunkenness, and violence that offended God. They saw not community bonding, but devilish disorder. One by one, under pressure from religious reformers and a growing urban middle class with different sensibilities, the old games were banned. Animal baiting was condemned as barbaric. The chaotic football matches were outlawed for causing riots and damaging property. And even the traditional Sunday games and ale-fueled festivals were suppressed in favor of sober prayer and work. For a time, it seemed the vibrant, messy heart of medieval popular culture had been stilled for good, its memory fading into the realm of superstition and crude peasant pastimes. But the thread was not severed, only buried. It would reemerge centuries later, transformed by a very different world. The 19th century brought a wave of romantic nostalgia for the Middle Ages, a reaction against the grime and anxiety of the Industrial Revolution. Victorian historians, artists, and writers like Sir Walter Scott looked back and saw not the harsh reality of peasant life, but a lost age of chivalry, honor, and picturesque simplicity. This romantic revival sparked a fascination with medieval pageantry, and from that fascination, the modern medieval festival was born. The key architects of this rebirth were not historians seeking brutal accuracy, but showmen and enthusiasts crafting family-friendly entertainment. They carefully curated the past, selecting the elements that fit their romantic vision. The glorious joust was resurrected as a thrilling spectacle of horsemanship and colorful heraldry. Archery contests returned as tests of skill rather than military necessity. The raw, violent folk wrestling and shin kicking were quietly left in the history books, deemed too crude for polite society. The brutal animal sports were, of course, completely excised, replaced by falconry displays that emphasize the noble bond between man and bird. This was a sanitized, safe Middle Ages, a pageant designed for education and amusement, not a reenactment of a way of life. The modern Renaissance fair or medieval festival is, therefore, a beautiful paradox. It is a living museum piece built on a romantic fiction. When you watch two knights thunder toward each other in a carefully choreographed joust, you are witnessing a descendant of a deadly serious martial contest, now performed with safety-tipped lances and strict rules to protect the performers. The bustling marketplace where you try your hand at axe throwing or archery is a direct echo of the festival stalls, but the kunai catchers have been replaced by friendly vendors. The feast is no longer a rare annual bounty, but a concession stand offering turkey legs and mead. This evolution is not a failure, it is an adaptation. The modern event captures the communal spirit, the sensory overload, and the sheer joy of play that defined the original festivals, while leaving behind the cruelty and mortal danger that were also part of that world. It allows us to touch a thread of our shared past, to marvel at the skills and pageantry, without having to endure the realities that made those celebrations so desperately needed. We have kept the crown of celebration, but we have reshaped it to fit a more compassionate head. So you find yourself wandering the grounds of a modern festival, the scent of wood smoke, and roasted turkey legs in the air. With this history in mind, your experience transforms. You are no longer just a spectator, but a detective, able to separate the threads of genuine tradition from pure theatrical fantasy. The first and most accessible gateway into the past is the archery range. Look for one where the bows are simple, long wooden staves without complex pulleys or sights, much like the yeoman's tool. The targets should be traditional circular bosses, not novelty shapes. When you nock an arrow and draw the string, you are participating in a practice that was once a matter of national defense. The satisfying thud of your arrow hitting the straw is the same sound that echoed across English practice butts for centuries. It is a direct, tangible link. For a more visceral thrill, seek out a quarterstaff demonstration. A good reenactor will not just spar, but will explain the footwork, the grips, and the physics of the weapon. They might even let you feel the weight of the staff and practice a basic block. This is not stage combat. It is a martial art being kept alive. You are feeling the heft of the common man's sword. Then, turn your eyes to the spectacle of the joust. A quality show will ground its pageantry in explanation. Listen for the herald announcing the knights, explaining the symbols on their shields. Watch how the knights handle their lances and how their specialized armor is constructed. The most authentic displays will narrate the scoring system, the shattering lance, the skill of remaining mounted. You are watching a dangerous sport turned into a safe, breathtaking ballet, but the underlying mechanics of honor and horsemanship remain true. Beyond the action, engage with the quieter arts. Visit a herald's tent, where you can learn to read a coat of arms. This visual language told a knight's entire story at a glance. Designing your own imaginary shield based on those ancient rules is a wonderful, creative way to understand medieval identity. You are learning to see the world through their eyes. Be wary, of course, of the pure fantasy. A booth selling dragon-shaped shields or offering to teach elf archery is fun, but it belongs to the realm of legend, not history. The real magic lies in the activities that have a documented thread back through time. When you pull a longbow, you are testing the same muscles that won battles. When you decipher a crest, you are cracking a code of lineage. The modern festival is a playground, but for the curious, it is also a living classroom. Your day becomes a series of choices, each one a chance to reach across the centuries and touch the rough grain of a world that was far more complex, brutal, and beautiful than any fairy tale. That question lingers in the air after the last lance has splintered and the final tankard is drained. We return to these games, not because we must, but because some deep human part of us still craves what they offer. On one level, it is a rebellion against the intangible. Our modern world is one of screens and abstractions, of digital victories and remote connections. To stand in a field, to feel the grain of a wooden quarterstaff in your hands, to draw back the string of a longbow and feel your muscles strain against its resistance. This is a profound reclamation of the physical. It is a satisfaction that no controller can provide, a reminder that our bodies are not just vessels for our minds, but instruments of direct, measurable action. We seek the honest feedback of a skill mastered through practice, the thud of an axe hitting its mark, the clean arc of a well-thrown stone. In a time of endless convenience, we are drawn to the elegant difficulty of a past that demanded competence with your own two hands. Then there is the pull of the story, the romance of a chivalric ideal that, for all its historical complexity, offers a compelling narrative. In a cynical age, the image of the honorable knight, fighting for a cause or a lady's favor, provides a clear, bright line between right and wrong. We are drawn to the pageantry, the heraldry, the sense of a code. It speaks to a longing for purpose and visible virtue, for contests where the rules are known and the virtues celebrated are courage, courtesy, and loyalty. It is a fantasy, yes, but one that satisfies a hunger for moral clarity and visible heroism that our own world often obscures. But perhaps the most powerful draw is the simplest, the raw, communal catharsis. When we gather to watch a modern joust or cheer for our friend in an archery contest, we are participating in the same primal social ritual. We are seeking a shared experience that is immediate and unfiltered. The collective gasp as riders collide, the united groan when a pin wobbles but does not fall, the roar of approval for a mighty throw. These are moments of pure, synchronized emotion. They forge a temporary tribe, connected by the spectacle unfolding before us. This is the antidote to isolation, a reminder that joy and tension are best experienced in a crowd, where excitement multiplies in the space between strangers becoming, for a moment, comrades. So, when we line up to try our hand at axe throwing or place a small wager on a wooden ring toss, we are answering a call that is centuries old. We are seeking the thrill of chance, the test of skill, the warmth of shared celebration. The tools have changed, the dangers are removed, but the core desires remain startlingly familiar. The laughter, the tension, the desire to prove oneself, the need to belong to something larger than our individual lives, these are human constants. Look around the next festival you attend. See the focused eyes of the archer, the proud smile of the victor holding their prized turkey leg, the families laughing together in the sun. Then ask yourself, listening to the timeless sounds of play, are we really so different from those who gathered on a muddy field 500 years ago, seeking the very same light in the midst of their own demanding world? The games of the medieval festival were a world in miniature, a vibrant and often contradictory reflection of the society that created them. From the thundering, chivalric theater of the joust to the lawless, muddy chaos of mob football, this was a spectrum of human expression as wide as the field itself. You had the disciplined silence of the falconer, the raw, screaming effort of the tug of war, the cunning deception of the dice game, and the simple, timeless laughter of children rolling hoops. Each contest, in its own way, held up a mirror to the medieval mind. It showed a rigid social hierarchy, where your birth determined whether you rode in the lists or pulled on a rope. It revealed a brutal acceptance of violence and chance, where pain was a teacher and luck a fickle god. It displayed a deep, ritualistic piety that could pause for a saint's day before erupting into sanctioned disorder. And above all, it celebrated an unbreakable human capacity for joy, for community, and for play as a fundamental need. These games were not an escape from life. They were an essential part of its fabric, weaving together the sacred and the profane, the noble and the common, in a spectacular, messy, and utterly human tapestry. So the next time you hear about a local Renaissance fair or a historical reenactment, go with this new perspective. Walk the grounds not just as a spectator, but as an explorer. See the archery range and think of the yeoman's duty. Watch the stage joust and appreciate the engineering behind the spectacle. Listen for the echoes of ancient community in the bustling crowd. And tell me down in the comments, which of these medieval games would you be most excited to try your hand at? Would you test your aim with a longbow, your balance with a quarterstaff, or your nerve in a gentle tug of war? Or perhaps, after hearing the full story, one game sounds far too dangerous for your taste. I think I'd personally keep a very safe distance from any contest involving shin